Poland. 1943. Malgorzata Twardecki stands frozen on the platform, watching the train disappear into the distance. Her 5-year-old son, Alojzy, is somewhere in one of those cars. She doesn't know where he's going. She doesn't know if she'll ever see him again. Between 1939 and 1944, this happened 200,000 times. Nazi Germany kidnapped 200,000 Polish children and held them in facilities where rows of cribs, baby cages, stretched for 100 meters. This is the story of Lebensborn, a program so systematic, so efficient at erasing identities, that right now, in 2025, there are 80-year-olds in Germany who have no idea they're actually Polish. You've heard of Nazi concentration camps. You might know about Auschwitz, about medical experiments, about the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. But there's one Nazi crime that's been almost forgotten, one that's rarely taught in schools, one that even most historians overlook, and it's still unfolding right now, today, in 2025. In the next half hour, you'll discover how the Nazis built an industrial system for kidnapping children, the 62-point racial examination that decided if a child would live or die, what happened inside those facilities with 100 meters of baby cages, the psychological techniques used to erase Polish identity from toddlers, the desperate mothers who searched for decades, the bitter reunions where sons didn't recognize their mothers, and why, right now today, there are elderly Germans discovering they're actually Polish. This isn't ancient history. This is living memory. Some of these stolen children are alive today, and many of them are just now finding out the truth. But first, let me take you back to that train platform, because what happened to Malgorzata's son is the key to understanding all of it. That morning started like any other morning in occupied Poland. Malgorzata was preparing breakfast. 5-year-old Alojzy was playing with wooden blocks on the floor. His older sister was helping their mother. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Then they heard the trucks. German military police arrived in the village at dawn. They went door to door with a list of children with specific characteristics, children who looked a certain way. They didn't knock on Malgorzata's door. They simply entered. 3 SS officers, 2 carried clipboards with forms, 1 carried a leather case. Inside the case were tools, metal calipers, the kind used to measure mechanical parts, rulers, protractors, a camera, charts showing different eye colors, hair textures, facial structures. But they weren't measuring parts. They were measuring children. The lead officer spoke in German. Malgorzata didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone. This wasn't a request. This was an order. They pointed to Alojzy. The 5-year-old looked up from his blocks, confused. The officer gestured for him to stand. Alojzy looked at his mother. She nodded, trying not to show fear. What happened next would be repeated 200,000 times across Poland and occupied territories. The officers measured Alojzy's head with calipers, front to back, side to side, the distance between his eyes, the length of his nose, the width of his nose, the thickness of his lips, the shape of his forehead, the angle of his chin. They recorded every measurement on their forms. They examined his hair, held strands up to the light, compared the color to a chart. Blonde, they wrote, almost white. They examined his eyes. Blue, Nordic blue, they noted. They photographed him from the front, from both sides, from behind. 3 photos that would go into a file. They filled out a form, 62 different measurements, 62 racial characteristics, 62 points that would decide his fate. The officers conferred quietly in German. They checked their charts. They compared Alojzy's measurements to the standards. Then one of them stamped the form. The stamp read, Eindeutschungsfähig, capable of Germanization. Alojzy had passed. The SS officer turned to Malgorzata. In broken Polish, he told her that her son needed medical treatment, that they were taking him to a health facility in Germany, that it was necessary for his well-being, that he would receive the best care, that he would be back soon, that this was for his own good. It was all lies. Malgorzata didn't believe them. But what could she do? These were SS officers, armed, backed by the full power of the occupying German military. She was a Polish mother in an occupied country. She had no rights, no power, no choice. She asked when he would return. They didn't answer. She asked where exactly he was going. They didn't answer. She asked if she could visit him. They told her no. They told her to pack a small bag for Alojzy. 1 change of clothes, nothing more. They would provide everything else, they said. With shaking hands, Malgorzata packed a small cloth bag, a shirt, pants, socks. She tucked in a small wooden figure that Alojzy loved, a carved horse his father had made. She held the bag for a moment, pressing it against her chest. Then they took him. Alojzy cried. He reached for his mother. "Mama," he called. "Mama." The officers pulled him toward the door. Malgorzata tried to follow. They blocked her path. Alojzy's cries echoed as they carried him to the truck outside. Through the window, Malgorzata watched the truck pull away. Her son's face was pressed against the canvas back, looking back at their home, at her. Then the truck turned a corner and was gone. That was the morning. By afternoon, Malgorzata received a brief typewritten notice. It stated that her son had been taken for medical evaluation and treatment in Germany. It stated that further inquiries should be directed to the Reich Health Office. It stated that this action was for the health and welfare of the child. It didn't state where in Germany. It didn't state which facility. It didn't state when he would return. It didn't even include a date. 3 days later, Malgorzata received another notice. This one instructed her to report to the train station. There she could see her son before his transport to Germany. She was not permitted to speak to him. She was not permitted to give him anything. She could only observe. She went to the station. There were dozens of other mothers there, some crying, some silent, in shock, some frantically asking the guards for information. The guards ignored them. Then the children were brought out. Dozens of them, ages ranging from toddlers to preteens, all with similar features, blonde hair, light eyes, Nordic characteristics. They were lined up on the platform, 2 by 2, like a school field trip. Malgorzata saw Alojzy. He was in the 3rd row. He looked small, scared, confused. When he saw his mother, he tried to run to her. A guard caught him, held him back. Alojzy reached out his arms. "Mama," he cried. "Mama." Malgorzata tried to go to him. Other guards blocked her. They formed a line between the mothers and the children. She could only stand there, watching her son cry for her, unable to reach him. Then the train arrived. The children were loaded into passenger cars, not cattle cars like those used for Jews being sent to death camps. These were regular passenger cars. Because these children weren't being sent to die, they were being sent to be transformed. Malgorzata pressed against the guards, trying to see which car Alojzy was in. She caught a glimpse of him at a window. His small hand pressed against the glass, his face wet with tears. The train whistle blew. The train began to move, slowly at first, then faster. Malgorzata ran alongside it as long as she could. She could see Alojzy's hand still pressed against the window, getting smaller, farther away. Then the train disappeared around a bend. She stood there on the platform long after the train was gone. Other mothers stood with her, some sobbing, some screaming at the guards, some simply staring at the empty tracks. Years later, Malgorzata would describe that moment in an interview. "You can't imagine what it is like to have a child stolen," she said. "We didn't give them our children. They stole them. Nobody had ever done anything as terrible as this." That was the last time Malgorzata saw her son for 10 years. She didn't know where that train was going. She couldn't have known. Because what the Nazis built was something most people still don't know about today. A program that remained classified. A program that most perpetrators destroyed records of before Germany surrendered. A program that even 80 years later remains one of the least understood Nazi crimes. They called it Lebensborn, spring of life. But to understand what it really was, we need to go back 6 years earlier, to December 1935, to a meeting in Berlin, to the man who designed it all. Meet Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, second most powerful man in Nazi Germany after Hitler, architect of the Holocaust, overseer of concentration camps, designer of the final solution, and creator of Lebensborn. On December 12, 1935, Himmler issued a directive creating the Lebensborn program. The stated goal was to increase the Germanic population. Germany's birth rate had been declining. Himmler saw this as an existential threat to the Aryan race. His solution was elegant, from a Nazi perspective. Create facilities where racially pure German women could give birth in secret. Encourage SS officers to father as many children as possible, whether married or not. Take in unwed mothers who might otherwise abort. Raise these children to be perfect examples of the master race. At first, that's all Lebensborn was. A breeding program. Homes scattered across Germany where pregnant women received excellent medical care, comfortable accommodation, and complete discretion. The children born in these homes were cared for until they could be adopted by SS families or raised in SS schools. It was disturbing, but it was voluntary. Women chose to participate. The program genuinely helped some unwed mothers who had nowhere else to turn. But by 1939, Himmler realized this approach wasn't working fast enough. Natural births, even encouraged breeding, couldn't produce 120 million Germans. The math didn't work. Even if every German woman had 4 or 5 children, it would take generations to reach Himmler's goal. So Himmler came up with a different plan. If you can't breed enough Aryans, simply redefine who counts as Aryan, find people who look Aryan, and make them German. In other words, steal them. On November 25, 1939, just 2 months after the invasion of Poland, a 40-page document was sent to Himmler. The title translated to English read, "The Issue of the Treatment of Population in Former Polish Territories from a Racial Political View." The last chapter of this document concerned racially valuable Polish children. It outlined a plan to forcefully acquire them for German purposes. The document stated, "We should exclude from deportations racially valuable children and raise them in Old Reich, in proper educational facilities or in German family care. The children must not be older than 8 or 10 years, because only till this age we can truly change their national identification, that is final Germanization." The document continued, "A condition for this is complete separation from any Polish relatives. Children will be given German names, their ancestry will be led by special office." This wasn't a proposal, this was a directive. On May 15, 1940, Himmler expanded on this in another document titled "Some Thoughts About the Treatment of Racial Aliens in the East." In it, he outlined his vision for the occupied territories. The Polish population would be reduced to a slave class. Education would be strictly limited. Children would be taught to count to 500, to write their own names, and that God commanded Poles to serve Germans, nothing more. But children who showed Aryan characteristics, they would be identified, tested, and if they passed, removed from their families and sent to Germany for Germanization. Himmler himself later stated it plainly. On November 14, 1943, he said, "Our duty is to take these children by force or through kidnapping. In this manner we will acquire for our benefit good racial blood." That's Heinrich Himmler, in his own words, stating that kidnapping children was not just acceptable, but a duty. The scale of what Himmler built is staggering. 10 Lebensborn facilities in Germany, 9 in Norway, 2 in Austria, 1 each in Belgium, Holland, France, Luxembourg, and Denmark. Some were converted castles, some were purpose-built. All were comfortable, clean, well-staffed facilities that looked more like resorts than concentration camps. Because these weren't concentration camps, the children weren't being killed, they were being transformed. Over 90,000 children were processed through Lebensborn facilities. The majority were kidnapped from occupied territories, most from Poland, some from Norway, where German soldiers had fathered children with Norwegian women, some from other occupied countries. An estimated 20,000 were deliberately kidnapped from Eastern Europe, specifically for Germanization. But numbers don't tell the full story. To understand Lebensborn, you need to understand the system, the industrial process by which Polish children were identified, sorted, erased, and reborn as Germans. Let me show you exactly how it worked. After the invasion of Poland in September 1939, German officers noticed something that surprised them. Poland had a significant population of people with stereotypically Nordic features: blonde hair, blue eyes, light skin, tall stature. To Nazi racial theorists, this created a paradox. These people looked Aryan, but they were Slavic. According to Nazi racial doctrine, Slavs were untermenschen, subhumans, inferior to Germanic peoples. Himmler's explanation: these blonde, blue-eyed Poles must be descendants of German settlers who had migrated east centuries earlier. They had German blood, they just didn't know it. Therefore they could be recovered, reclaimed, Germanized. It was racist pseudoscience, of course, but it provided the ideological justification for what came next. In February 1942, SS Gruppenführer Ulrich Greifeld from Himmler's office issued Directive 67-1. This directive outlined exactly how the kidnapping program would work. Polish children with suitable Aryan characteristics would be identified. Local German officials, police, teachers, and SS officers would scout for candidates. They would look for children with the right hair color, eye color, facial features. Once identified, children would be taken away from their parents under the pretext that their health was at risk. Parents would be told their children needed medical evaluation or treatment. Parents would be told it was temporary. The children would be sent to selection centers in Lodz or Kalisz. There, they would be photographed and analyzed according to 62 physical characteristics. Nazi racial experts from the main office for race and resettlement would conduct detailed examinations. Let me show you exactly what they measured, because understanding this system is crucial to understanding the crime. The 62-point racial examination began with basic appearance, hair color, measured not just as blonde or brown, but on a detailed scale. Platinum blonde was preferred, golden blonde was acceptable, dark blonde was questionable, light brown was borderline, anything darker was usually disqualifying. They examined hair texture. Straight was preferred, wavy was acceptable, curly raised questions, kinky was disqualifying. Eye color was measured using special charts. They categorized eyes into multiple shades of blue, green, gray, hazel, and brown. Clear blue was most valued. Gray blue was acceptable. Green or hazel were borderline. Brown was usually disqualifying, though exceptions were made if other features were sufficiently Nordic. Then came cranial measurements. Nazi racial scientists believed skull shape indicated race. They used calipers to measure skull length from front to back, skull width from side to side. The ratio between these measurements was calculated to determine if the skull was properly dolichocephalic, that is, long-headed, which they believed indicated Nordic ancestry. They measured the distance between the eyes, the height from the bridge of the nose to the hairline, the length of the face from hairline to chin, the width of the face at the cheekbones. The nose was examined in detail. They measured nose length from bridge to tip, nose width at the nostrils, the angle of the nose from the face, the shape of the nostrils. A narrow, straight nose was ideal. A wide nose, or one with flared nostrils, was problematic. They examined lip thickness. Thin lips were preferred. Full lips raised questions. They measured the prominence of the chin. A well-defined chin was good. A receding chin was concerning. Ears were examined for size and shape. The forehead was assessed for slope and prominence. Cheekbones were evaluated for height and definition. They assessed body proportions, height relative to age, limb length, torso length. Children who were tall and long-limbed were preferred. They evaluated skin tone. Pale skin was ideal. Any hint of darker complexion raised red flags. They examined teeth. Straight teeth were better. They looked for any signs of what they considered degenerate features. For girls as young as 6 years old, they even measured pelvic width, not for any reason related to childhood health, but because they were evaluating these children as future breeding stock for the master race. A wider pelvis meant easier childbirth, which meant more German babies in the future. Every measurement was recorded on detailed forms. Every characteristic was scored against Nazi racial standards. Each child was assigned to one of 11 racial categories based on how closely they matched the Aryan ideal. The examination took hours. Can you imagine being a 4 or 5-year-old child, already traumatized by being torn from your parents, subjected to this? Men in white coats measuring every part of your body with cold metal tools, taking notes, photographing you from every angle, speaking in a language you don't understand, looking at you not as a child but as a specimen. After the physical examination came psychological testing. Nazi experts would evaluate the child's intelligence, temperament, and teachability. They looked for signs that the child could be successfully Germanized. Children who seemed intelligent and compliant were preferred. Children who seemed dull or stubborn were problematic. Then came the sorting. Based on these examinations, children were placed into 3 categories. Category 1, racially valuable. These were children who scored highest on the racial examination. Children who most closely matched the Nordic ideal. Children deemed worthy of becoming German. These children were sent to Lebensborn facilities for Germanization, then placed with German families for adoption. Category 2, capable of work. These were children who had some Aryan features but not enough to be worth Germanizing. Perhaps their eyes were the wrong color. Perhaps their nose was too wide. Perhaps their skull measurements were off. These children were sent to labor camps. Even children as young as 8 or 9 were put to work in factories, farms, or construction. Many died from overwork, malnutrition, or disease. Those who survived were essentially slave laborers for the Reich. Category 3, racially worthless. These were children who failed the racial examination. Children who didn't look Aryan enough. Children who Nazi racial scientists deemed to have no value whatsoever. These children were sent to concentration camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, or they were sent to special facilities where they were killed through poisoning. Death certificates listed cause of death as pneumonia. Let me be absolutely clear about what this means. A 5-year-old Polish child would be measured with calipers. If their skull was 3 millimeters too wide, they were sent to die. If their eyes were brown instead of blue, they were sent to die. If their nose was judged too broad by a racist Nazi pseudoscientist, they were sent to die. Children were murdered not for anything they did, not for any crime, not even for being Jewish, though Jewish children were automatically sent to Category 3. These Polish children were murdered simply for not looking Aryan enough. The children who passed were hardly more fortunate, because passing meant erasure. Alojzy passed. His measurements were recorded as ideal. His file was stamped eindeutschungsfähig. Within days, he was on another train, heading to a Lebensborn facility in Germany. Let me show you what that looked like. This is what a Lebensborn facility looked like, and I need you to really picture this, because the image is crucial to understanding the crime. Imagine a large building. In some cases a converted castle or manor house, in others a purpose-built facility. From the outside it looked pleasant, well-maintained, gardens, clean white walls, nothing like the brutal architecture of concentration camps. Inside, the entry areas were decorated tastefully, comfortable furniture, Aryan imagery, portraits of Hitler and Himmler, everything designed to impress visiting German couples who would adopt the children. But in the back of these facilities were the housing areas, and this is where the baby cages come in. Picture a massive hall, high ceilings, white walls, fluorescent lighting that stays on 24 hours a day, and filling this hall, row after row after row of metal cribs. In some facilities these rows stretched for 100 meters. That's the length of a football field, the full length of a professional soccer pitch. Imagine standing at one end and looking down the length of a football field, but instead of grass you see rows of white metal cribs stretching away from you into the distance. Each crib was approximately 2 feet wide by 2 feet long by 2.5 feet tall. Metal frame, metal bars on all 4 sides, a thin mattress at the bottom, maybe a single blanket. That was it. The bars were necessary, they said, to prevent children from climbing out, to keep them safe. But the effect was unmistakable. These looked like cages, baby cages. The cribs were arranged in precise rows, military precision. Everything about Lebensborn reflected Nazi obsession with order and efficiency. Each row was labeled, each crib was numbered, each child was inventoried. Inside each cage was a child, some as young as 2 years old, some as old as 6 or 7, all recently taken from their families, all Polish or Norwegian, or from other occupied territories, all blonde, all blue-eyed, all meeting the racial criteria, all crying. If you've ever been in a hospital nursery or a large daycare, you know the sound of multiple children crying. It's overwhelming, distressing, impossible to ignore. Now imagine that sound amplified across 100 meters of cribs, dozens, sometimes over 100 children, all crying at once, all calling for mothers who weren't there. The facilities were staffed by SS nurses, women who believed in the Nazi cause, women who had been trained in the racial sciences, women who saw these children not as victims but as genetic material being recovered for the Reich. The nurses wore white uniforms, spotlessly clean. They maintained strict schedules, feeding times, sleeping times, cleaning times, everything regimented, everything controlled. The children were fed, they were changed, they were kept physically healthy. This wasn't a death camp. The goal wasn't to kill these children. The goal was to transform them. Over 90,000 children passed through these facilities. Most were between ages 2 and 6, young enough to forget, young enough that their identities could be rewritten. The process began immediately upon arrival. Each child was given a new name, always German. Often the new name was a German version of their Polish name. Wojciech became Wolfgang, Katarzyna became Katharina, Alojzy became Alois, Jan became Johann, Zofia became Sophie. Nazi administrators thought this was clever. The child would respond to a name that sounded familiar. It would make the transition easier. What they didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care, was that this preserved a thread of connection to the old identity. Many survivors later said that their German name always felt wrong, even though they couldn't remember why. Each child was given a false birth certificate, a new birth date, often close to their real one, a new birthplace, always in Germany, new parents, listed as German names that were completely fabricated. Their real birth records, if they existed, were destroyed. The children were given new identification papers, new medical records that made no mention of Poland. Everything was designed to sever any connection to their past. Then came the psychological conditioning. The SS nurses had been trained in what we would now recognize as psychological manipulation techniques. Their goal was to make the children forget Poland, forget their families, forget their language, and accept a new German identity. The first technique was linguistic isolation. From the moment a child arrived, only German was spoken. If a child spoke Polish, they were ignored. If they persisted in speaking Polish, they were punished. Sometimes with physical discipline, sometimes simply by withholding affection or attention. Children learn quickly. Within days, they learned that speaking Polish resulted in negative outcomes. Speaking German, even poorly, resulted in praise and attention. The second technique was rewriting memory. The nurses told the children, repeatedly, that their parents had abandoned them, that their mothers didn't want them, that Poland had rejected them, but Germany wanted them. Germany would take care of them. To a small child who doesn't understand geopolitics or war or racial ideology, this simple explanation makes terrible sense. If Mama isn't here, maybe she really doesn't want me. If these German nurses are taking care of me, maybe they're my family now. The third technique was positive reinforcement of German identity. Children who quickly adopted German names, German language, German behavior, were rewarded with extra food, toys, affection. Children who resisted were isolated. The fourth technique was religious and cultural indoctrination. The children were taught Nazi ideology from the start. They were shown pictures of Hitler, taught to give the Nazi salute, taught songs praising the fatherland. Christianity was permitted, but filtered through Nazi ideology. They were taught that Germans were the master race, that the Aryan people were chosen by God and nature to rule. The fifth technique, perhaps the most insidious, was creating positive associations with Germany. The facilities, despite the baby cages, were relatively comfortable compared to occupied Poland. The children were fed regularly. They had clean clothes. They had warm beds. Medical care was available. For children who had lived through the brutality of occupation, this seemed like luxury. The message was clear. Poland meant deprivation and separation. Germany meant comfort and care. Nazi psychologists understood something that modern psychologists have confirmed. Young children are remarkably adaptable. Their identities are still forming. Their memories are malleable. With enough pressure, enough consistency, enough time, you can rewrite a child's sense of self. Children taken at age 2 or 3 had almost no chance of remembering their real families. Within 6 months, they would have no memory of Poland. Within a year, they would believe they had always been German. Children taken at age 4 or 5, like Alojzy, retained fragmentary memories. They might remember a face, a voice, a feeling, but they couldn't put names to these memories. Over time, even these fragments would fade. Children taken at age 6 or older were more difficult. They had stronger memories. They resisted more. Some never fully accepted German identity. These children were often beaten more severely. Some were deemed failures and sent to labor camps after all. Others learned to hide their resistance, to pretend to be German while holding on to their Polish identity in secret. The duration of stay in Lebensborn facilities varied. Some children were there for only a few weeks before being placed with German families. Others remained for months. A few remained for years. The determining factor was how quickly the child was deemed ready. Ready meant speaking only German. Ready meant responding to their German name without hesitation. Ready meant showing no visible signs of Polish identity. Ready meant not crying for mama anymore. When a child was deemed ready, they were put up for adoption. German couples who wanted to adopt would apply through SS channels. Childless SS families were given priority. They would visit the Lebensborn facilities. They would meet the children who were available. They would choose. It was shopping for children. The couple would walk down those rows of cribs, looking at the children, asking about their ages and temperaments. If they found a child they liked, they could take that child home. The children were presented to potential parents as German orphans. The adoptive families were told these children were ethnic Germans who had been found in orphanages in the conquered Eastern territories. They were told the children's Polish parents had died or abandoned them. They were told they were rescuing German children from inferior Polish orphanages. Most German families genuinely believed this. They thought they were doing a good deed. They had no idea these children had been deliberately kidnapped from loving families. The adoptive families would take the children to their homes across Germany and Austria. They would raise them as Germans. Many families were kind. They loved these children. They had no idea they were participating in a massive crime. After 6 months in the Lebensborn facility, Alojzy, as he was now called, was deemed ready. A German couple from Munich visited the facility. They were in their 30s. The husband was an SS officer. The wife was a homemaker. They had been trying to have children for years without success. They desperately wanted a child. They walked through the facility. They saw Alojzy, 6 years old now, blonde hair, blue eyes, quiet and well-behaved, perfect. They spent time with him, gave him a toy, a wooden car. He played with it silently. They asked him his name. Alojzy, he said. They asked where he was from. Germany, he said. The nurses had trained him well. The couple decided to adopt him. Papers were signed. Alojzy was given to his new German parents. They took him to Munich. He would live there for the next 8 years. Meanwhile, 700 kilometers away in Poland, Malgorzata was still searching. For 10 years, Malgorzata Twardecki searched for her son. Let me show you what that decade looked like, because the mother's stories are as important as the children's stories. This crime destroyed families in both directions. The first place Malgorzata looked was the paperwork. The notice she'd been given mentioned the Reich Health Office. She tried to write letters. The Polish postal system was disrupted by war, but she managed to send several letters to German authorities, asking for information about her son. She never received a reply. She tried going through Polish resistance networks. Underground organizations sometimes helped smuggle information. She asked if anyone knew anything about where children were being taken. Some people had heard rumors. Germany, that was all anyone knew. Germany was a large country. Where in Germany? After the war ended in May 1945, Malgorzata thought her searching would get easier. She was wrong. In March 1947, the Polish government created the Office for the Recovery of Children. Finally, there was an official organization dedicated to finding the stolen children. The office was led by a Polish lawyer named Roman Hraba. He became a hero to thousands of Polish families. Hraba's team faced an almost impossible task: find 200,000 children scattered across Germany, Austria, and occupied territories, identify them despite false papers, prove they were Polish despite German documents saying otherwise, convince German families to give them up, convince the children themselves to return to families they no longer remembered. Malgorzata registered with Hraba's office. She provided all the information she could: Alojzy's real name, his birth date, his appearance, the date he was taken, the village he was taken from, a photograph from before he was taken. Hraba's team added her case to thousands of others. They began the methodical work of searching. They contacted Allied occupation authorities in Germany. They asked for access to Nazi records. Many records had been destroyed, but some survived. They found fragments of Lebensborn documentation, lists of facilities, some names of children, though many used only case numbers, dates of transfers. They sent investigators to Germany to visit the locations of former Lebensborn facilities. Many had been converted to other uses after the war: hospitals, orphanages, government offices, but some records remained. They interviewed German families who had adopted children from Lebensborn. Many of these families refused to cooperate. They insisted their children were German orphans. They refused to believe the children had been kidnapped. Some genuinely didn't know. Others suspected but didn't want to lose the children they'd raised. They searched for children who matched descriptions: blonde hair, blue eyes, the right age, born around the right time, who seemed to have gaps in their memories, who had German papers but Polish features. The work was painstakingly slow. Each case could take months or years to investigate. Malgorzata waited. She received occasional updates from Hraba's office. They were still looking. They had some leads. Nothing concrete yet. Please continue to be patient. She waited through 1947, through 1948, through 1949. Each year her son was growing up without her. Each year he was becoming more German. Each year the chance of recovering him diminished. By 1950, 5 years after the war ended, Hraba's office had recovered about 15,000 children. That sounds impressive, until you realize it represented less than 8% of the total. 105,000 children remained missing. Malgorzata's case remained unsolved. She tried other avenues. She worked with the Polish Red Cross, who were also involved in family reunification efforts. She put notices in Polish newspapers, asking if anyone had information. She traveled to displaced persons camps, looking at orphaned children, hoping to recognize her son. She didn't find him. The years passed. 1952, 1953. Alojzy would be a teenager now. Would she even recognize him? Would he remember her? Then in 1954, 9 years after the war ended, she received a letter from Roman Hraba's office. They had found him. The investigators had cross-referenced fragmentary Lebensborn records with adoption records in Munich. They had found a boy named Alojzy, adopted in 1943, age 6. The dates matched. The original documentation, though incomplete, suggested Polish origin. The adoptive family's papers claimed he was a German orphan from occupied territories. The investigators approached the family. They requested to interview the boy. The family initially refused. Finally, after legal pressure from Allied authorities, they agreed. The investigators showed Alojzy photographs. Did he recognize anyone? No. They showed him a photo of Malgorzata. Anything familiar? He shrugged. Maybe. He didn't know. They asked about his earliest memories. He remembered the German family. He remembered the Lebensborn facility. Vaguely. Before that? Unclear. Fragments. A woman's face. But he thought that must have been a nurse at the facility. They showed him his original Polish birth record, which had been recovered from a government archive in Poland. His real name was Alojzy Twardecki. He was born in 1938. His mother was Malgorzata Twardecki. Did he remember that name? No. They told him he had been taken from his mother when he was 5, that his mother had been searching for him for 9 years, that she wanted to see him. Alojzy, now 16 years old, didn't know what to feel. This was supposed to be good news, but he didn't remember this woman. He didn't remember Poland. He didn't speak Polish. He was German, wasn't he? The investigators contacted Malgorzata. They told her they had found her son. He was alive. He was healthy. He was living with a German family in Munich. Did she want to see him? Did she want to see him? She had waited 10 years for this moment. Arrangements were made. Alojzy, who still thought of himself as Alojzy, would come to Poland to meet his mother. The German family was legally required to allow this, though they were unhappy about it. They had raised this boy for 8 years. He was their son now. In the summer of 1954, Alojzy arrived in Poland. He was escorted by representatives from the recovery office. They brought him to Malgorzata's home in the village he'd been taken from. Malgorzata waited outside her house. She saw the car approach. She saw a teenage boy get out. Tall, blonde, blue eyes, the same eyes. But everything else had changed. He was almost a man now. She had lost his entire childhood. She approached him. Alojzy, she said. She spoke in Polish. He looked at her uncomfortably. He didn't understand. He spoke to the officials in German. What did she say? The official translated. She called you Alojzy. That was your Polish name. Alojzy shook his head slightly. My name is Alojzy, he said in German. Malgorzata reached out to embrace him. He stiffened. He didn't resist, but he didn't return the embrace. He was hugging a stranger. Over the next few days, Malgorzata tried to reconnect with her son. She showed him photographs from when he was small. She told him stories about his early childhood. She tried to speak to him in Polish, hoping it might trigger memories. He was polite, but distant. He spoke to her only through a translator. He showed no recognition, no emotional connection, no desire to stay in Poland. Malgorzata tried to talk to him about what happened, about the Nazis, about the kidnapping, about the camps and the atrocities and the millions of Poles who died. Alojzy didn't believe her. He'd been taught a different history, the German version. In his education, Germany was the victim. Germany had been forced to defend itself. The stories about camps and mass murder were propaganda, exaggerations by the victors. Malgorzata couldn't talk to him about Nazi atrocities and mass murders in Poland because he believed the German wartime press. After a week, Alojzy asked to go back to Germany, back to the only family he remembered, back to the parents who had raised him, back to the country he called home. Legally, Malgorzata had a claim. He was her son. She could insist he stay in Poland. But what would that accomplish? Force him to live with a stranger, keep him in a country he didn't know, where he didn't speak the language. She let him go, but she asked him to stay in touch, to write letters, to visit again. He agreed, though his tone suggested it was out of politeness, not genuine desire. Alojzy returned to Munich. He lived there for several more years. He finished his schooling. He struggled with identity questions. Who was he? German or Polish? Alojzy or Alojzy? He didn't feel Polish, but now he questioned whether he was really German. In his 20s, Alojzy began to investigate his own history. He learned more about Lebensborn. He learned about the kidnapping program. He came to understand that what happened to him was a crime, that he was a victim, but the damage was done. His childhood was stolen. His identity was fractured. He eventually moved back to Poland. He legally changed his name back to Alojzy Twardecki. He learned Polish, though he always spoke with an accent. He spent time with his mother, though their relationship remained strained. Too much had been lost. In 1979, he wrote a book, The School of Janissaries, Letters to a German Friend. In it, he grappled with his stolen identity, with the psychological damage of being erased and rewritten, with the impossible question of who he really was. He remained in contact with his German adoptive family as well. They were his family too, in a different way. They had raised him, loved him. They weren't the villains. They were also victims of Nazi lies. Alojzy lived with this fractured identity for the rest of his life. He died without ever fully resolving it. And Malgorzata, she got her son back, but not really. The 5-year-old boy she had lost was gone forever. The teenage stranger who returned was someone else. She spent the rest of her life mourning the childhood they had both lost, and they were among the lucky ones, because they found each other. Most didn't. After the war, Roman Hrabar and his team searched for years, decades, in some cases. They recovered some children, but most of the 200,000 were never found. The final count, 200,000 Polish children kidnapped, approximately 30,000 found and returned to Poland. That's a 15% recovery rate. 170,000 Polish children were never found, never identified, never returned, simply vanished into German society. Why did the search fail for so many? Reason number 1, false documents. Every child had been given a new name, new birth date, new birthplace. Birth records had been destroyed. Without documentation proving who they really were, how could investigators identify them? Reason number 2, Nazi record destruction. As Germany collapsed in 1945, SS officials destroyed as many Lebensborn records as possible. They burned files, shredded papers, smashed file cabinets. They knew what they had done was criminal. They tried to hide the evidence. Most Lebensborn documentation was lost. Reason number 3, German families refused to cooperate. Many families who had adopted Lebensborn children refused to give them up. These were children they had raised for years. These were their sons and daughters now. Some families genuinely believed the children were German orphans. Others suspected the truth, but didn't want to lose their children. And legally, they often had the upper hand. They had documents. The Polish government had only suspicions. Reason number 4, Allied authorities were reluctant to intervene. After the war, Allied forces occupied Germany. They had the authority to compel families to return stolen children, but they rarely did. Partly because documentation was so poor, partly because they didn't want to traumatize children by forcibly removing them from the only families they remembered, partly because some Allied officials sympathized more with German families than with Polish claims. Reason number 5, the children themselves refused. This was perhaps the most heartbreaking reason. Many children, when found, didn't want to return to Poland. They had been successfully Germanized. They believed they were German. They didn't remember Poland. They didn't speak Polish. They didn't feel any connection to their biological families. When Polish officials told them, "You are really Polish, you were kidnapped," they didn't believe it, or they didn't care. Germany was home. In some cases, children themselves refused to come back to their original families. They were victims of Nazi propaganda and believed they were pure Germans. Imagine being Roman Hrabar. You find a Polish child who was kidnapped. You have documentation proving it. You locate the child's biological mother, who has been searching for years. You bring them together, and the child rejects the mother. The child insists on returning to Germany. The child says, "I'm German, not Polish." What do? Legally, you could force the child to stay, but ethically, is it right to force a teenager to abandon the only family they remember, to force them to live in a country they don't know? Hrabar and his team grappled with these impossible questions in thousands of cases. By the 1950s, the window for recovery was closing. Children who had been toddlers in 1943 were teenagers by 1953. Their memories of Poland were gone. Their German identities were solidified. Recovery became increasingly difficult and increasingly traumatic. By 1960, most recovery efforts had ended. The Office for Recovery of Children was eventually dissolved. Some 30,000 children had been found. 170,000 remained missing. But here's what makes this even more haunting. It's not just history. It's still unfolding right now. To this day, there are tens of thousands of people in Germany completely unaware that they were kidnapped from Poland in their childhood. Think about that. Right now, today, In 2025, there are people in their 80s living in Germany who have no idea they're actually Polish. They have German names, German papers, German families. They've lived their entire lives as Germans. They've raised German children. They have German grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They don't know their real names. They don't know their real birth dates. They don't know they had Polish mothers who searched for them until they died. They don't know they're part of one of history's largest kidnapping schemes. How is this possible? How can someone live 80 years and not know something so fundamental about themselves? Because the Nazis were thorough. The false documents were perfect. The Germanization was complete. And after 80 years, everyone who might have known the truth is dead. The SS officers who did the kidnapping, the nurses who ran the Lebensborn facilities, the Polish parents who watched their children disappear, they're all gone now. The only people left are the stolen children themselves, and they don't remember. But DNA testing is changing that. In 2021, Maria Fine was 77 years old. She had been born in Latvia in 1943, or so she thought. She had been told she was an orphan. She had been placed for adoption and came to the United States as a child. She grew up American. She had a full life, marriage, children, grandchildren. Then, in her 70s, she started researching her past. She wanted to know more about her origins. She took a DNA test through one of those ancestry websites. The results surprised her. Her genetic background was heavily Latvian, but the test also matched her with distant relatives in Poland. How could that be? She started digging. She found records from a Latvian orphanage. She found records of a displaced persons program after World War II. She found mentions of Lebensborn. I was astonished to learn about Lebensborn, she said in an interview in 2021. She came to realize that she had likely been taken as an infant. Her parents may have been killed, or she may have been kidnapped for Germanization, but ended up in the post-war chaos of displaced persons camps. She would never know for certain. All the people who knew were dead. But DNA testing gave her pieces of the puzzle. She learned her genetic ancestry. She connected with distant relatives. She learned the truth about Lebensborn. Stories like Maria's are becoming more common. In the 2010s and 2020s, as DNA testing became popular, people started discovering unexpected truths about their heritage. Germans taking DNA tests for fun, discovering they have significant Polish ancestry. But they're German. They've always been German. How can they be Polish? They start investigating. They find birth records that don't match their papers. They find adoption records from the 1940s. They find references to Lebensborn or similar programs. The pieces start coming together. At age 75, a man discovers his name should be Wojciech, not Wolfgang. He investigates and finds fragments of records suggesting he was taken from Poland in 1942. He learns his German parents weren't his birth parents. He tries to find Polish relatives. Most are dead. He finds some distant cousins. They don't share memories. They don't share language. They don't share culture, but they share DNA. At age 80, a woman discovers through DNA testing that her ancestry is Polish. She investigates and finds that she was adopted from a Lebensborn facility as a child. She learns her German name is false. She tries to find her birth name. The records are lost. She'll never know what her mother called her. At age 82, a man learns through DNA matching that he has a first cousin in Poland. That's impossible, he thinks. He doesn't have Polish family. But the DNA doesn't lie. He reaches out to the cousin. Through conversation, they piece together the story. His birth mother had several children. He was the youngest, taken by Nazis in 1943. His older siblings survived. One had children. This is that child, now elderly himself. They meet. His cousin shows him photographs of his birth mother, a woman who searched for him for 30 years before she died in 1975, a woman he has no memory of. How does it feel to discover at age 82 that your entire identity was a lie, that you're not who you thought you were, that you had a mother who loved you and searched for you, that you have a whole heritage you knew nothing about? There's no good answer to these questions. There's an organization in Germany called Stolen Children, Forgotten Victims, in German Geraubte Kinder, Vergessene Opfer. They work to identify remaining Lebensborn victims. They help people investigate their pasts. They try to connect people with Polish relatives when any can be found. They estimate there are still thousands of people alive who were victims of Lebensborn but don't know it. Most are in their 80s now. Time is running out. Soon all the Lebensborn children will be dead. The living link to this crime will be gone. That's why organizations like Stolen Children are working urgently. They're trying to tell these stories while survivors are still alive. They're trying to identify as many victims as possible. They're trying to ensure this crime is remembered, because it's in danger of being forgotten. When most people think of Nazi crimes, they think of the Holocaust. They think of gas chambers. They think of Auschwitz and Treblinka. They don't think of baby cages. They don't think of kidnapped children. They don't think of identity theft on a massive scale. But Lebensborn was genocide too, just a different kind. The UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, passed in 1948, includes this in its definition of genocide. Article 2, Section E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. That's exactly what Lebensborn was. The forcible transfer of Polish children to the German group, the deliberate erasure of Polish identity, the systematic attempt to absorb Polish genetics into the German nation while destroying Polish culture. It's genocide. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg declared it so. The robbery of children was declared a crime of genocide. The UN declared it a crime against humanity, but the perpetrators were barely punished. Heinrich Himmler, architect of Lebensborn, committed suicide before he could be tried. Most SS officers who ran the Lebensborn facilities were never charged. The nurses who lied to children were never prosecuted. The doctors who sorted children by race continued their medical careers after the war. Many used the excuse that they were just following orders. The German families who adopted the children, they were not prosecuted. Legally, they were considered victims of Nazi lies, and in most cases that was true. They genuinely didn't know, or they had been told the children were German orphans. They can't be blamed for believing official documents. But the result is that almost no one faced consequences for this massive crime. 200,000 children stolen, countless families destroyed, generations scarred, and essentially no justice. Let me bring you back to where we started. The train platform, the rows of cribs, the stolen children. Malgorzata Twardecki lived until 1987. She spent her final years in the same village where Alojzy had been taken from. Her son would visit occasionally, but they never fully reconnected. Too much had been lost. Before she died, she gave one final interview. The interviewer asked her what the worst part was. She thought for a long time. Finally, she said, "The worst part was not knowing. For 10 years, I didn't know if my son was alive or dead. I didn't know if he was suffering. I didn't know if he remembered me. I could only imagine, and the imagination is terrible." Then she paused. She added, "But even after I found him, I still didn't know, because the boy I found wasn't the boy I lost. I had found his body, but his soul, his identity, who he was, that was gone. The Nazis didn't kill my son, but they murdered who he was supposed to be. You can't imagine what it is like to have a child stolen," she said. "We didn't give them our children, they stole them. Nobody had ever done anything as terrible as this. The baby cages are gone now. The Lebensborn facilities were closed in 1945. Some were converted to hospitals, some to schools, some to government offices. The metal cribs were discarded or repurposed. The buildings remain, but their purpose has been erased. But their legacy lives on, in families torn apart, in identities stolen, in children who never found their way home, in people alive today who don't know who they really are. This was Nazi Germany's spring of life, Lebensborn, built on the theft of 200,000 childhoods, built on the systematic erasure of 200,000 identities, built on the grief of 200,000 mothers. 170,000 of those children were never found, never identified, never returned. They lived their lives as Germans. They died as Germans. They never knew they were Polish. Their children don't know. Their grandchildren don't know. Their great-grandchildren don't know. Somewhere in Germany today, there's an elderly person who doesn't know their real name, who doesn't know they had a mother who searched for them for decades, who doesn't know they're part of one of history's greatest crimes. If you're watching this from Germany, and you were born between 1939 and 1944, particularly if you were told you were an orphan from the Eastern Territories, I encourage you to ask questions. Talk to organizations like Stolen Children, Forgotten Victims. Take a DNA test. Investigate your past. You deserve to know the truth. If you're watching this from Poland, and your family lost a child during the war, know that there are people still searching, organizations still working. There's still a chance, however small, of finding answers. And if you're watching this from anywhere else, remember this story. Share it. Because 170,000 families are still missing answers. Because history forgotten is history repeated. Because crimes unpunished become crimes acceptable. The baby cages stretched for 100 meters. Each cage held a stolen child. Each child represented a family destroyed. Each child was proof of a crime so systematic, so coldly efficient, we're still counting victims 80 years later. Thank you for watching, for listening, for remembering. These children deserve to have their stories told. These families deserve to be remembered. This crime deserves to be known. For more untold World War II stories like this, please subscribe. There are more stories that need to be told, more crimes that have been forgotten, more victims who deserve to be remembered. And if you or someone you know might be a Lebensborn child, please reach out to the organizations helping reunite families. It's not too late. There's still time. There are still people searching. Thank you for watching and for remembering.